In war, there are no golden rules. On an autumn Friday in the year 1415, an English king led his army into combat, knowing that he was vastly outnumbered by his French adversaries. That morning, on a narrow stretch of ploughed field near the French village of Agincourt, the English men of King Henry V formed into position. Men-at-arms in the centre, archers on the flanks. In total, around 6,000 men, commanded by a young monarch who had already proved himself a leader. But the task that now faced King Henry V was daunting. Facing him was the cream of French chivalry, the finest knights of the land, at the head of a force some 30,000 strong. Two armies, seemingly mismatched, were about to write the latest chapter of the 100 Years' War. For the French, the day would be a national disaster. For the nation of England, it would be an almost unsurpassed day of glory.
Henry V's victory at Agincourt in 1415 must rank as the greatest achievement of an English king in warfare.
It also had a pretty dramatic effect on English position in France for the next 20 to 30 years. And in the context of the Europe of the 15th century, it was a very unexpected victory. The Kingdom of France was the premier kingdom.
The 100 Years' War is the name given to the series of military conflicts between France and England between 1337 and 1453. Agincourt is the most famous battle of the war, but the events of 1415 had their origins as far back as 1066, when William the Conqueror plundered the throne of England and created a political problem that would plague Anglo-French relations for centuries. William, as Duke of Normandy, controlled a large area of French territory. In 1154, William's great-grandson, Henry II, became King of England, and as Henry had married the divorced Queen of France, he secured her French territories. The King of England now possessed more French land than the King of France. By the year 1337, the dispute between the two nations had erupted into open conflict. That year, the French King Philip VI seized the English territory of Guyenne. In 1338, England's King Edward III led an army into northern France, and the 100 Years' War had begun. The confrontation was further inflamed by Edward's claim that, through his mother, he was actually the rightful King of France. 70 years of war and occasional peace later, these rival claims over territory and succession had still not been resolved. But in 1413, a new English king came to the throne. It was this young king who would lead his nation at the Battle of Agincourt. King Henry V.
Henry V was the complete soldier. He had been knighted in 1399, aged only 13, and he fought his first battle, aged 16, at Shrewsbury in 1403 when he was wounded in the face and yet fought on in order to support his father's claim to the throne. In the succeeding decade, he learnt all the rules of siege warfare, defeating rebellion in Wales. He really was a most accomplished soldier, and he was both a strict disciplinarian and a charismatic commander.
He also has the common touch. When he was Prince Hal, he really acquired some affinity with the people, which he always retained. And this led him in good stead when he became a leader, because he then could associate with the soldiers and knew what they wanted. So in that sense, he was a pious man, a dedicated man, a good leader.
As soon as Henry had ascended the throne, it was obvious that his ambitions lay across the English Channel in France.
By a weird quirk of genealogy, not only could Henry V claim to be King of England and ruler of a lot of France, but he could actually claim to be the rightful King of France. And the kingship of France was in dispute, and he had a claim through his great-great-grandmother, who was Isabella, the she-wolf of France. And through Isabella, Henry V claimed that he ought to be king of France.
Henry demanded the French throne and marriage to the French king's daughter. He knew he was unlikely to realize these ambitions through the formal negotiations that began shortly after his accession. So he also began to prepare for war. Noblemen and knights of the realm were contracted to join an army, bringing with them their retinues of fighting men. In total, around 2,500 men-at-arms. They were joined by some 8,000 other soldiers, included because of their mastery of the most deadly weapon of medieval warfare, the longbow.
The longbow was itself about 6 feet tall and fired an arrow which was about 3 feet long with a metal tip. It had an advantage over the bows that were used, for example, at Hastings. The range of them were about 100 yards. So one of the great advantages of the longbow was that it had a range of about 400 yards.
It was very easily handled in comparison to the French weapon, which was the crossbow, which was a rather complicated piece of equipment, which took a minute to loose off one of its shafts, called a quarrel. In that time, an English archer could shoot off 12 or 20 if he wished. It did mean, though, that he had to train from a very young age. This was actually dictated by statute, by law in England. The French were unwilling to equip their peasantry in the same way because they feared rebellion against the crown.
By the summer of 1415, Henry's preparations for war were complete, and he prepared to set sail from Southampton on his flagship, the Trinite Royale. The negotiations were now over. It was said that they concluded with a French diplomat presenting King Henry with a box of tennis balls, implying that sport was a better pastime for a young king than war. On Sunday, the 11th of August, 1415, King Henry's army began its journey to France, at its date with destiny at Agincourt. The Trinite Royale led an armada of ships into the English Channel. As well as the fighting troops, they had to carry support personnel, including engineers and priests. The fleet also transported the huge quantity of material required for a successful military campaign. This would have included the huge siege guns and perhaps as many as 20,000 horses. After 3 days at sea, this enormous force had successfully crossed the Channel, entering the estuary of the River Seine, south of the town of Harfleur.
Henry's plan was very simple. It was to take Harfleur. Then there were several options that no doubt he'd considered. One possibility would have been a march to the south to link up with the few remaining English possessions from the once mighty Duchy of Gascony. Another possibility would have been to march north and to go to Calais, which the English held.
The response of the French leadership to Henry V's invasion was indecisive. The King, Charles VI, was mentally unstable, only occasionally lucid and incapable of command. This meant the armies in the field were led by two of the officers of his court, the Marshal and the Seneschal. In addition, there were two political parties, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs in the country, who had actually been engaged in civil war. So France was not well led.
It took 2 days for Henry's army to disembark. But once this was achieved, the English king moved quickly in pursuit of his objectives. He ordered that the people of Harfleur surrender their town. But the townsfolk knew that their town was well defended, its strong walls reinforced with some 26 towers and a moat, and breached only by 3 gates which were themselves protected. The surrounding area also favoured the defenders. The land was marshy and made even more difficult by deliberate defensive flooding. King Henry now had only one choice. He would have to take Harfleur by siege. On the 18th of August, the siege of Harfleur began in earnest, with the capture of the land east of the town by men led by the Duke of Clarence. The town was now surrounded, English troops to the east and west, flooded land north and south, across which small English boats travelled to maintain contact with each other. Now Henry had to decide which siege tactics to use. The moat prevented the use of one widely used weapon, the battering ram, so Henry decided to undermine the integrity of Harfleur's walls by deploying his miners to the east of the town. Their intention: to dig shafts beneath the town walls and then start fires, causing the wall to collapse. It was already a well-established technique, but the English miners were thwarted by French countermining and repeated sallies out of Harfleur by men of the town's garrison. The English commander was now aware that the capture of the town would take time, and it would require the deployment of the most massive weapons of his time: the siege artillery.
The siege of Harfleur, in addition to traditional catapults and other older types of siege engines, the English had guns. They had big guns, big siege guns, 12 foot long, 2 feet across. They could fire whole millstones at the walls of the town. They could take big rocks. I mean, quite a big, you could put a 500-pound rock into one of these guns. They'd cover them with tow and pitch and light them on fire and shoot them into the town to set buildings on fire. Tremendously powerful weapons, but these are craft weapons. They're built one by craftsmen. So you can't have too many of them. Take a long time to make. They're very expensive. And gunpowder was very hard to come by. Making gunpowder was also a craft. So we had very few of these big guns and very little powder to fire from them.
They're pretty primitive, large, immobile, short-range weapons. I mean, don't think in terms of a modern artillery piece throwing a shell 20 miles. A late medieval cannon will throw a large ball of stone, about 800 meters maybe.
For weeks, the English artillery pounded the walls of Harfleur, their fire concentrated on the gate to the southwest of the town. If this well-protected opening could be destroyed, the town was there for the taking. Day after day, huge stones rained down. The impact was devastating, but Harfleur's defenders stood up bravely to the onslaught. Brave sallies out of the town continued to harass the besieging forces, and by mid-September, the town had still not fallen. But the southwest gate was now on the point of collapse, despite heroic efforts to preserve it. The besieged citizens accepted the inevitable and, following another huge artillery bombardment, they agreed to surrender. Under the laws of chivalry, this saved their town from a sacking by the English. On the 23rd of September, King Henry rode into Harfleur. He had achieved his first victory on foreign soil, but the price had been high. It had taken 5 hard weeks to capture the town.
The main difficulties of siege warfare are actually keeping your besieging force in the field, making sure that it's properly supplied. Now, in fact, Henry had a good chance here because he could have ships coming across the channel and providing food. Water's always a big problem, and in fact, it was probably water that led to the spread of dysentery in his army, which killed about a third, killed or incapacitated a third, and this was both ordinary soldiers and the great nobles. They weren't spared.
1 in 5 of Henry's army died, and they were yet to engage the full French army, which was right then organizing itself in response to the English venture. At Saint-Denis, on the 10th of September, King Charles VI ceremonially raised the Oriflamme, the French war standard. The pride of 2 nations was now at stake. Aware of his weaknesses, Henry abandoned his original idea of heading south to Bordeaux. A new objective was required. His first thought was typical of the chivalric age. He proposed to settle the whole French dispute in single combat with Dauphin Louis, the French king's 19-year-old son. But when Louis refused the challenge, Henry decided to head for the English port of Calais, 100 miles to the north, leaving behind a garrison some 1,500 strong to secure his new English possession. On the 8th of October, Henry V left Harfleur with his original army of 10,000 men, now reduced to 6,000. In pouring rain, they headed north along the coast. In the days that followed, the English advanced steadily towards the river Somme, with only occasional skirmishing to distract them. To facilitate the potentially difficult crossing of the Somme, Henry had ordered the English captain of Calais to send a force of men to secure the ford at Blanchetaque. But when the vanguard captured a prisoner while just 6 miles south of the crossing, a terrible truth dawned upon the English. For the captured man revealed that a force of some 6,000 Frenchmen were waiting for them across the river. There was only one credible option for the English army. They would have to turn inland and attempt to cross the Somme at some other point. But Henry's troops were now soaked and weary. Dysentery still persisted. Rations secured at Harfleur were now running out, and the French were present in large numbers along the north bank of the Somme. This was the advance guard of the French army, under the command of 2 talented commanders, Jean Boucicaut, the Marshal of France, and Charles d'Albret, the Constable. Another grueling march now loomed, and on the 13th of October, Henry's dispirited force began to move inland along the path of the Somme. Unsurprisingly, many of Henry's men began to suffer a loss of morale, but their commander was able to maintain firm discipline, as he had done since the start of the expedition.
Henry was clearly an effective leader, partly because, and this is becoming less common in the 15th century, he was a leader who led from the front. He was a warrior as well as a general. He's also an effective leader because he seems to have been quite good at communicating to his men about their circumstances and what they're doing.
He was determined that his troops would behave well. He issues a series of ordinances which each soldier has to obey, and in particular, because he is, of course, says he has a just cause and he's got the support of the church, he is very, very strong against people who violate church property. That's why the person that is recorded as being hanged for stealing from a church is highlighted in Shakespeare's play. Undoubtedly, it was his personality, his determination, his ruthlessness that made that army the disciplined body that it was.
King Henry was again able to maintain order when he added to the burden on his prime fighting men. Realizing they were vulnerable to French cavalry attack, he ordered each man to cut themselves 6-foot wooden stakes that could be sharpened at both ends and that could be hammered into the ground to form a defense against French horse. At Agincourt, the value of these wooden stakes would be clearly seen. But as the march along the Somme continued, their sheer weight must have depressed a body of men already reduced to living on nuts and berries. But despite these privations, by the 18th of October, the English had reached the village of Nesle, with the French military only occasionally revealing themselves. That night, Henry discovered that 2 fords over the river were unguarded, just 2 miles away, at Voyenne and Betancourt. The following day, the ragged English force at last crossed the Somme, and morale received a welcome boost. The movements of the French forces during the English march along the Somme are not entirely clear, but we know the French advance guard under Boucicaut and d'Albret were in a position north of the Somme, following the English as they moved inland. Around the 14th of October, the main French army set off northeast towards Henry's forces, reaching the city of Amiens just after the English had left the area. The full French army now joined up, a total of perhaps 30,000 men. But it was not led by their king, the unfortunate Charles VI, or his son, the Dauphin. In fact, it was hardly led at all.
The French command structure was not just weak, it was non-existent. The supposed leaders were the marshal, a man called Boucicaut, and the seneschal, d'Albret, but they were just officers of the household, and they had to compete with nobles of the royal line, like Alençon and Orléans, and in actual fact, on the day of the battle, it was they who took charge. So really, it was a complete mess.
Jean Boucicaut and Charles d'Albret were undeniably talented military commanders, and they argued that the best way to beat the invading Englishmen was to avoid an open battle altogether. Instead, the invaders should be harried and denied supplies by a so-called scorched earth approach. But theirs were just 2 voices amongst the fragmented French military leadership. Noblemen such as the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Burgundy, and his bitter rival, the Duke of Orléans, favoured a more aggressive approach. It was their view which prevailed. On Sunday, the 20th of October, 3 French heralds rode to the English camp at Attique. Their mission? To formally challenge King Henry to battle.
It seems to me a flaw was that if your aim was to weaken the enemy, you should be constantly attacking him with your troops, which are an overwhelming majority. He's probably only got somewhere in the region of 6,000 men. You've got the region of 20 to 25,000 men. Why are you not trying to attack him in a series of battles and weaken him rather than trying to wait for one particular battle. There are flaws in both the leadership and the plan.
King Henry's response to the challenge made by the French heralds was defiant. He told them that Calais was his destination and warned the French not to attempt to stop him. Were they to do so, a great shedding of Christian blood would be the consequence. The heralds rode off, leaving the English to prepare for battle. Armour was donned and bowstrings tested. Men went to the priests to make final confessions, and, although their commander appeared confident, he must have shared some of the fears of his troops. He was outnumbered by 5 to 1 in an enemy country. And so it was that on the morning of Monday the 21st of October 1415, he waited for the French army and the defining moment of his life. However, it slowly became clear that no attack was forthcoming. So, in the afternoon, King Henry and his men resumed their march towards Calais. On the 23rd, the English crossed the river Canche, past Frevent. The following day, the Ternoise was crossed near Blangy. On the far side of the river, Henry's advanced scouts could at last see the huge force that opposed them. A moment of battle was less than 24 hours away. That night, King Henry made his camp near the tiny village of Maisoncelles, while the vastly bigger French army positioned itself near the village that would give its name to the battle to come, Agincourt. On the morning of Friday the 25th of October 1415, on a ploughed field in northern France, history was about to be made. A last-ditch attempt by King Henry to secure a negotiated settlement was dismissed by the French, and by 8 o'clock, both sides had drawn up into their battle positions 1,000 yards apart. The French forces were organized into 3 divisions, with the vanguard comprising some 8,000 men-at-arms drawn from the highest ranks of French society. Armored men steeped in the traditions of the age of chivalry. Unknown to them, it was an age drawing to its end.
The problem at the Battle of Agincourt was that the French still thought they were fighting simply a chivalrous battle. That's why a large number of their men-at-arms got into the front rank, because what they thought they were going to do was go and capture a few people for ransom. Unfortunately, there weren't many men-at-arms on the other side, as it were. I think there were 2 separate ideas going on. It wasn't essentially a battle between knights.
The upper-class French men-at-arms were nominally commanded by Constable d'Albret, though he had little influence upon their actions once fighting began. This elite vanguard was flanked by cavalry, and it was these 2 contingents who would lead the French attack. Behind them were the men of the 2nd French Division. Similar in size to the vanguard, this division is likely to have included the several thousand French crossbowmen and archers. Finally, a large reserve cavalry division was positioned in the rear, to be brought into action when the English had been put to rout. French confidence was understandable. The army that opposed them was but a fraction of the size of their own. In the English positions, behind a wall of protective stakes, King Henry took command of the centre, leading a contingent of men-at-arms, with the Duke of York to his right and Lord Camoys to the left. In total, the English centre numbered a mere 1,000 men. It was on the flanks that real English strength was deployed. A total of 5,000 archers. Before the battle, King Henry rode before his lines to inspire his men, and sought especially to inspire his bowmen. He reminded them that the French had made a grim promise to cut off 3 fingers from the right hand of any captured English archer in order that they could never fire a bow again. As they listened to the words of their king, many of the English archers must have wondered what their fate would be. But at least there was one small sign to reassure them. Their young king was wearing no spurs. Henry would therefore be fighting on foot alongside his fellow countrymen.
It's difficult to believe that Henry looked out on the morning of the Battle of Agincourt and was 100% optimistic. The odds were against him. It's a formidable host. He's still quite a long way from Calais, and he's going to fight a battle that he clearly would rather not have to fight. However, in some ways, history is on Henry's side. Previous large set-piece engagements in the 100 Years' War had on the whole been favourable to the English. And both the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Poitiers, fought by Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, both of them outnumbered English armies and inflicted quite spectacular defeats on the French.
Henry V was an experienced commander. He knew that war is chaotic. He knew that anything can happen on a battlefield. He had to have known that. And as a result, I think that King Henry V knew that he could win.
As the morning passed, the two armies maintained their positions. The French knew that sooner or later the English would be compelled to come forward. It was not a mistaken view. Henry now consulted his senior commanders, and the fateful decision was made. At 11 o'clock, Henry gave the order for the protective stakes to be removed from the ground. The English men crossed themselves, kissed the ground, and marched in good order towards the enemy. They were outnumbered by 5 to 1. About 250 yards from the French line, the English advance halted. The wooden stakes were planted once more, and the archers were given the order to attack. In response, the French vanguard began its advance, while the flanking cavalry rode to engage the English bowmen. The Battle of Agincourt had begun.
The French, in approaching the English at the Battle of Agincourt, are confined in 2 different sorts of ways. There's the ground itself, which is very wet and freshly ploughed, so quite hard to move through in heavy plate armour. And also on either side of the English line there are fairly thick woods that make it hard to bypass the English, and indeed tend to channel the French towards the centre of the English line. Now that's the only sort of position that an army as badly outnumbered as the English could have actually defended.
From the beginning, the battle was ferocious, with the French feeling the brunt of the fighting. Both of the initial French maneuvers had failed. As thousands of English arrows descended from the skies, the advancing French centre found itself hampered by the muddy ground and by the fact that their line contained too many men for a relatively narrow battlefield. On the flanks, the French cavalry was also soon in trouble. It was almost impossible for the mounted soldier to move amongst the stakes as the English bowmen continued their merciless rate of fire.
There was actually a plan for defeating the English army by using a double envelopment of cavalry attacks which would drive off the archers and then leave the English men-at-arms to be beaten by a larger number of the French. Unfortunately, this didn't work on the day, and one reason was that the French cavalry did not expect the stakes that were used at the Battle of Agincourt, and therefore they were unable to ride the archers down. They ended up impaled on the stakes instead.
After a matter of minutes, the French cavalry were forced into bloody retreat. But there was only one place they could retreat to: back into the advancing lines of their own vanguard, which was itself already reeling from the impact of the English arrows. As riderless horses caused mayhem in the ranks, the 2nd Division began to move forward into the crush. In the centre, the leading French men-at-arms eventually ploughed their way to the English line. The result was fierce hand-to-hand combat with axe, spear, pole and sword, with Henry himself at the heart of the action. The French also fought bravely, but many of their finest soldiers simply lacked the room to fight effectively, while all the time the English arrows rained down relentlessly upon them.
The archers are utterly essential at Agincourt to understanding the English victory. It's the archers that provoke the French to committing themselves to an attack. It's the archers that then bring within minutes the French cavalry charge which starts the battle properly into ruin. And the archers then cause immense chaos when the main French van advances on foot. They're firing arrows at 10 per minute and they inflict enormous damage. And of course subsequently, even though the archers are lightly armed, they're well placed to intervene in the fighting on the ground, the hand-to-hand fighting, because the French are so tightly packed together that their heavy armour and their heavy weapons become a liability, not an asset, in the face of the more lightly armoured but more mobile archers.
It's interesting that the French didn't seem to use their missile arm at all. They did actually have a number of crossbowmen, and they had a plan for putting them in the front rank and using them to counter the English archers. But on the day, the French were so overconfident that they were just going to capture the English king, get all the ransoms from him and his men, that they pushed their own crossbowmen back behind the lines where they were ineffective, so that they really didn't take part.
We can only guess at King Henry's thoughts as the fighting continued all around him. The front line was now a mass of dead and wounded bodies, and the vast majority of them were French. Their decimated vanguard had been forced back into their own advancing 2nd Division, a development which had served only to further hamper their ability to fight. To add to their difficulties, their entire leadership was now lost. The cream of French nobility lay amongst the heaps of dead that defined the battlefield after what was possibly as little as half an hour's fighting. Constable d'Albret was dead. Marshal Boucicaut was captured. The French battle standard was lost. The result of the battle was now virtually certain. Many in the French rear began to drift away while they still could. The 3rd Division chose not to engage at all and began to break up without a fight. The French had been routed, but the killing was not yet over. By early afternoon, King Henry was all but victorious. But he could not be completely certain that his enemy would not regroup to join battle once more. The Dukes of Alençon and Bar exhorted their fellow Frenchmen to continue the fight. One brave group of French nobles did succeed in organizing a mounted counterattack, while many of their fellow men were already fleeing from the scene. But the seemingly triumphant Henry now received serious news. He was told that an isolated French force had attacked his baggage train in the rear.
Now, prior to the battle, he'd got wind of what the French battle plan was. Their initial phase was that they would attack his archers with their cavalry, but they would also send cavalry around the back, round the outside, to attack his baggage train. And what he now thought was, this was the French putting a second phase of their battle plan into action. They were not beaten, they were not dispersed, they had a large number of troops ready to attack him, and here was that cavalry going round to cause confusion in his baggage train.
As a result, he decided to eliminate the threat of French prisoners taking up arms against him, and he said that they would have to be killed.
However, Henry's men-at-arms and knights refused to carry out the bloody task. They could not bring themselves to slaughter men of their own class.
At the time, and in the circumstances of Agincourt, killing prisoners was a dubious thing for several reasons. Simply because at the time the chivalric code actually said you should spare a fellow Christian knight who'd surrendered. Secondly, and much more importantly, of course, if you'd taken a knight prisoner, that made you a potentially much wealthier person. And if you were a relatively humble man-at-arms and you had a French count as your prisoner, it was a bit like winning the national lottery nowadays is. So there was strong resistance to that sort of killing.
In the end, Henry was compelled to call up his own bodyguard of Welsh archers to carry out the most controversial act of this bloodiest of battles.
The reason that Henry chose the archers to carry out the task is that he could order them. They didn't have the same sense of honour as people who had been knighted, people of the elite military class. He instructed a squire to lead some 50 archers, apparently, to start the massacre.
Now, whether it was more a matter of just frog marching with a few people being killed to encourage them to do it quickly off the battlefield, or whether there was a more comprehensive slaughter, it's not quite so easy to say. But most modern accounts of the battle would now suggest that the massacre has been a little bit exaggerated traditionally.
Long before sunset, it became clear that no successful French counterattack was forthcoming, and the day belonged to King Henry V of England. He had won against all the odds, and it was his enemy which had been routed. Around 10,000 Frenchmen had lost their lives. Less than 300 Englishmen had shared their fate. It may have been as few as 100, with the Duke of York as the only prominent casualty from the nobility. 4 days later, news of Henry's unlikely triumph reached London. Within hours, church bells were ringing across England, celebrating one of the most remarkable military victories of all time.
England hadn't done very well in the 100 Years' War, so there was a fair amount of, if I call it national frustration. So at that level, The Battle of Agincourt not only reinforced Henry V's own position as king, but also made the English people feel good. Their morale rose, it gave them the sense of good being.
The great victory at Agincourt marked the end of Henry's 1415 French campaign. His men were victorious, but they were also exhausted and unlikely to be able to force further gains. He therefore headed for Calais as he had originally intended, before returning to England in triumph.
The victory at Agincourt was remarkable in the context of the 100 Years' War because it really was a decisive victory. As a result of it, and Henry's continued campaigning in Normandy, he was able to establish a colony in northern France, which lasted for the best part of 2 decades and actually survived really into the middle part of the century. So it did have a dramatic effect.
In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes confirmed Henry V's marriage to the French king's daughter Catherine, and his new status as heir to the throne of France. But the French crown would never be his to wear. 2 years later, he became ill while in France, planning a new crusade to the Holy Land. On the 31st of August 1422, King Henry V of England died. He was just 34 years of age.
Henry's early death in 1422 meant that the whole fruits of the battle in the long term had been lost.
Agincourt, in an odd way, it's the beginning of the end. It's not obvious after the battle itself, but it's the Indian summer of English influence in France.
It was a victory of the few against the many. It was a defeated army pulling success out of the ashes. But there was no long-term English domination of big parts of France as a result. It was, in many ways, a bit of an isolated incident in the grand political scheme of things. And it was just a good day for the English soldier.